Fear is a universal emotion. It visits everyone, regardless of age, status, or strength. Sometimes it whispers in the background, barely noticeable. Other times, it roars loudly, paralyzing us, clouding our judgment, and holding us back from the life we are meant to live. But what if fear isn't something to run from? What if it can become our greatest teacher? In the teachings of the Buddha, fear is not an enemy. It is not something to be destroyed or avoided. Instead, it is something to be understood. When we bring awareness to our fear, when we sit with it instead of fleeing from it, we begin to uncover its deeper message. We start to see that fear often points not to danger, but to growth. And when met with wisdom, fear can become fuel. It can become motivation. This video is a journey through timeless Buddhist stories that show us how to transform fear into strength. Each story you'll hear is more than just an ancient tale. It is a mirror reflecting the very struggles we face today in a world full of uncertainty, pressure, and inner doubts. Whether it's the fear of failure, loss, rejection, or simply the fear of not being enough, these stories offer insight, comfort, and direction. We will walk alongside monks who faced their deepest anxieties in silence, villagers who overcame hardship with compassion, and even kings who learned that true power lies not in control, but in surrender. With every story, a thread of wisdom is woven, a reminder that fear, when seen through the lens of mindfulness, can awaken courage, purpose, and resilience. Before we begin, take a moment to pause. Breathe in, breathe out. You don't need to resist your fears right now. You only need to be present with them. Trust that within each uncomfortable feeling lies the seed of transformation. These stories are not just meant to inspire. They are here to remind you of what you already carry inside, the ability to face life as it is and rise with clarity and intention, to meet fear and choose to move forward anyway. Let us now begin the journey. The path from fear to motivation starts here. The earth trembled in silence beneath the gray sky, as if the mountains themselves were holding their breath. In the southern reaches of the land, where ancient trails were scorched by the fire of ages past, rose the looming presence of Mount Kazari, a volcano long thought to be asleep. Yet now, smoke began to slither once more from its blackened throat, a quiet warning to those who had forgotten the language of nature's wrath. Not far from its base, in a crumbling monastery clinging to a cliffside like a bird's nest, a monk named Javin sat in stillness. His head was shaved smooth. His robes were sun-faded, and in his eyes lingered the calm of one who had seen the heart of fear and made peace with it. In a nearby village, nestled between fields of rice and ash, lived a woman of great age and quiet endurance. Her name was Amma, though most had long stopped calling her anything at all. Her back was bent like the crescent moon, and her hands were marked with the stories of decades spent growing, grinding, and grieving. She had lost 3 sons to the mountain, 2 to its eruption, 1 to its silence. Yet she remained, watering her tiny garden beside the hut she refused to abandon, eyes always drawn to the ridge where smoke began to gather once more. To Amma, fear had once been a beast that stalked her dreams. But in time, it had become something else, a companion that reminded her she was still alive. Further down the valley, near the river where the trees grew thick and the winds carried scents of moss and flame, lived a young man named Kale. His body was built like the trunks of the forest, thick, powerful, seemingly unshakable. He could lift barrels of water as if they were baskets of feathers and run faster than the storm winds. But within him, a different story brewed. He feared the fire, not just the volcano's roar, but the fire of judgment, of failure, of being seen as weak. Though the villagers praised his strength, Kael never felt worthy. He trained his muscles endlessly to silence the trembling in his chest. He laughed loudly to drown the whispers in his mind. But when the smoke began to curl from Mount Kasari, something deeper stirred within him, something he could not lift or outrun. Word spread quickly. The mountain was waking. Birds flew in strange patterns, and the river sang with a new urgency. Monks from distant temples sent messages sealed in wax and worry. And deep within the monastery walls, Javan stood before a faded map, tracing a narrow trail that cut across the volcano's southern flank. It was old, dangerous, but still possible, just barely. To cross it would mean reaching the northern valley, where sacred texts and relics of forgotten wisdom lay hidden, saved generations ago from destruction. Javan knew what had to be done. The journey would need balance, endurance, and strength, not of the body alone, but of heart and will. And so, he descended into the valley, robes fluttering like banners of silence. He walked first to Amma's hut, where the old woman was pruning her basil. Without words, he offered her a bundle of prayer beads and pointed to the mountain. She looked at him, then at the sky, then at the path that wound like a scar up the slope. Her lips did not tremble. She rose slowly, collected a shawl, and nodded. The past had taken much, but perhaps now she could offer something back. Javan then found Kyle, kneeling beside the river, punching the earth as if it could answer his questions. The monk simply placed a hand on his shoulder, and for a long time, they said nothing. But the hand remained steady and warm, until Kyle rose, breathing not from pride, but from the raw ache of readiness. The journey began before the sun crested the eastern ridge, while the world was still draped in that heavy veil of blue shadow that precedes dawn. Their footsteps were slow but steady, crunching along a forgotten path carved centuries ago by pilgrims and fools alike. The forest clung tightly to the trail, as though trying to hold them back, branches reaching like arms, roots curling like questions beneath the soil. Javan walked at the front, his back straight despite his years, guided not by haste, but by inner clarity. Amma followed in silence, every step a memory, every breath a soft defiance. Kyle brought up the rear, his strong legs twitching with tension, eyes darting to every movement in the brush, every murmur in the wind. As the incline sharpened and the trail grew more treacherous, the trees thinned, giving way to fields of volcanic stone, jagged, black, and brittle beneath the weight of time. The air grew warmer, as though the mountain itself exhaled in warning. From beneath the cracks came faint wisps of sulfur, reminding them of the hidden fire that slept beneath their feet. Yet no one turned back, not because they lacked fear, but because their fear had been repurposed, turned inward like fuel into a lantern. Javan whispered prayers with each breath, not to plead for safety, but to remain anchored. Amma hummed softly to herself, melodies of lost lullabies that soothed a mother's aching heart. Kyle gritted his teeth, but kept climbing, each step a fight against the voices in his head that screamed he was not enough. They reached a plateau just past noon, where the land flattened briefly before it tilted again toward the summit. From there, they could see the distant horizon and the river below, now a mere ribbon of silver, winding through a quilt of green. The wind howled more fiercely here, tearing at robes and sleeves, singing in the broken stones. It was here that Javan paused, placing a flat palm on the earth, eyes closed. Amma joined him, kneeling beside a rock blackened by past eruptions. Kyle stood, chest heaving, fists clenched, not from exertion, but from the dread rising inside him, like steam from fissures. Here, Javan began a ritual, not one of magic, but of remembrance. A silence, settled, not empty, but full of the mountain's breath. And they listened, not to words, but to the fire below and to the silence above. When they rose again, the sky had begun to shift. Clouds gathered, not thick, but swift, casting strange patterns of light and shadow over the ash-scarred ground. The final leg of the journey loomed ahead, a narrow pass skirting the edge of a broken caldera. The rocks were brittle, the drop steep, and the wind relentless. Javan went first, each step a whisper on the crumbling edge. Amma followed, not with hesitation, but with the grace of one who had walked many edges before. But Kael stood frozen, not because of the height, but because of what the fall represented. Failure, humiliation, death, not of the body, but of self-worth. His muscles twitched, but his feet did not move. And there, on that narrow ledge, between past and possible, fear found him. Not the roar of fire, but the cold grip of doubt. Javan did not call out. He did not coax or command. He simply waited, standing firm on the other side of the pass, eyes calm, trusting. Amma, halfway across, turned slightly, not to urge, but to remind Kael with her presence that he was not alone. Still, Kael trembled, until suddenly something within him cracked, not from pressure, but from a realization that fear was not the enemy. Fear was fire, yes, but fire could warm or burn, and he could choose. With a breath drawn from the base of his soul, Kael stepped forward. His body remembered the strength, but now his heart carried it. One step, then another, each one a hammer blow against his old self, each step a rising. The air changed as they passed the narrow ledge and entered the basin of the mountain. It was a vast bowl of black stone, open to the sky, yet somehow enclosed in its own silence. Ash fell lightly from above, swirling like snow, but stinging as it touched the skin. Beneath their feet, the ground was no longer solid. It pulsed faintly, like a heartbeat too deep to hear. The wind here did not howl. It whispered, strange and low, as if the volcano were speaking in a forgotten tongue. Javan paused, only briefly, breathing deeply, as though inhaling the truth buried beneath layers of fire and stone. Amma pressed forward, step by careful step, her old feet steady as a drum beat in the darkness. Kael followed them both, eyes wide, not with fear now, but with reverence. In the very center of the basin, they came upon the first true sign of danger. A chasm yawned before them, wide and deep, glowing faintly with molten light. The heat surged from below in waves that rippled the air, distorting sight and thought. A single beam of ancient stone stretched across it, narrow, cracked, treacherous. It was a relic from a time when monks crossed here, not with fear, but as pilgrimage. Javan stepped forward and pressed his palm to the the stone. It was warm, but not cruel. It seemed to hum with memory, not menace. He did not hesitate. Slowly, he walked out onto the beam. Arms lowered, mind stilled. Every breath, a vow of presence. The stone did not break. He did not fall. Amma came next. Her body was frail, but her will was iron. She placed her bare feet onto the beam and walked, not with balance born of strength, but of surrender. She had long stopped fighting her fear. It walked with her now, beside her, whispering old wounds. But she did not waver. She did not rush. And when she reached the far side, she stood tall, older than the mountain itself in her stillness. Behind her, Kael stood trembling. His arms, so used to lifting, now felt useless. His legs, trained for speed, wanted to bolt, but he did not move. He stared at the stone bridge, then down into the fiery throat of the world. What he saw there was not death, but the shadow of his own doubt, glowing red and rising like a ghost. He closed his eyes. He remembered the jeers of children long ago, mocking him for his fear of fire. He remembered his father's silence, the way strength was demanded without kindness. He remembered the day he saved a child from drowning, how his hands shook, not from exertion, but from the fear he would fail, and yet he had not. He remembered the monk's hand on his shoulder, the old woman's steps, the weight of his own name, Kael. He opened his eyes, and then he stepped onto the stone. Each step was slow. Each one burned, but it was not the fire of lava. It was the fire of becoming. When he reached the other side, something had changed, not in the mountain, but in him. The fear had not left, but it had melted into something useful. It was still there, coiled deep inside, but now it drove him forward instead of holding him back. They walked on, the three of them, deeper into the mountain's core. The air thickened, humming with invisible power. Above them, the sky was no longer visible, just red light diffused through rising smoke. They had entered the heart, and the heart was alive. Beneath the mountain's crust, where stone turned to fire and silence deepened into presence, they came upon a vast chamber, neither cave nor cathedral, but something in between. The walls glowed faintly with veins of molten gold, pulsing like arteries of the earth itself. In the center of the chamber stood an ancient pedestal, cracked with age, and upon it, a single bowl carved from obsidian. Around the pedestal lay a perfect circle of ash, undisturbed, as though protected by time. This, Javan knew, was the heart of Mount Kasari, not its fiery core, but its sacred center, where wisdom from the ancients once flowed like spring water through stone. The monk stepped forward and knelt before the bowl. His fingers traced the rim, not to possess, but to remember. This was not an offering to be taken, but a question to be heard. He closed his eyes and listened, not to the wind nor the mountain's rumble, but to the silence between his own thoughts. Within that stillness, he felt it, not words, but an understanding. That fear, when seen with open eyes, reveals not threat, but path. That every tremor, every hesitation is the sound of transformation beginning. He bowed deeply, not in worship, but in gratitude, and rose. Then Amma approached. Her movements were slow, not from weakness, but reverence. She stepped across the circle of ash, pausing with each footfall, as if retracing every sorrow she had buried. Her hands trembled as they hovered above the bowl, not from fear of what it was, but from the memories it stirred. She saw the faces of her sons in the reflection, young, bold, and gone. She felt the grief swell, the fire rise, and then she let it pass, not pushed away, but released. Her tears fell quietly, steaming as they touched the ash, but when she turned away, her eyes were clear, and her shoulders, though stooped, were unburdened. Lastly, Kael came forward. He did not kneel. He stood before the bowl like one before a mirror. What he saw was not fire, not ash, but himself, raw, trembling, and real. He reached out, not to take, but to accept. He touched the edge of the bowl, and in that moment, something inside him aligned. The muscles he had trained now felt like threads tied to something deeper, a will, a purpose. He saw himself not as a warrior, nor a coward, but as a becoming, not fixed, not broken, but in motion. And that was enough. He bowed his head, not in defeat, but in beginning. Together, the three turned and left the chamber, each in silence, each changed. They did not speak, for there was nothing left to explain. The mountain had not erupted. It did not need to. The fire had already risen, not in destruction, but in each of them. And as they emerged once more into the light of day, their feet touched ground that trembled no more. Behind them, the volcano stood, not dormant, but understood. The descent was quiet, not from exhaustion, but from fulfillment. They moved not as pilgrims fleeing danger, but as those returning from a sacred rite of passage. The mountain loomed behind them, like a guardian no longer misunderstood. The path, once treacherous, now seemed familiar, almost kind. Javan walked with the grace of one who no longer sought to guide, but to witness. Amma's steps were slower now, not because she was weak, but because she finally allowed herself to feel the softness of the earth. And Kael, the young man once crushed by invisible weights, walked upright, not puffed with pride, but anchored with calm. Their journey down was not a return, but a continuation. When they returned to the village, the people gathered, not with cheers, but with reverence. They saw in the three travelers something that could not be named: a quiet strength, a steadiness that spoke more than any tale. Children ran to Kael, touching his arms with awe, not for their size, but for the stillness they held. Elders bowed gently to Amma, no longer as a relic of the past, but as a keeper of lessons forged in flame. And to Javan, no one spoke, yet all listened, because his silence echoed louder than words. Kael no longer sought to prove his strength. He built with it. He worked beside others, not ahead of them, carrying stone and wood with the ease of someone who no longer needed to be seen. When storms came and fear rose in the village, it was Kael who calmed the young, not by words, but by presence. Fear, once a storm within him, had become a fire in the hearth, a warmth shared, a strength distributed. In lifting others, he had lifted himself. Amma returned to her garden, but something in her had changed. She no longer tended it for survival, but for remembrance. Each herb, each root she grew now carried the scent of her journey. Basil, like the air on the ridge. Ginger, like the warmth of her tears. Children came to her not only for remedies, but for stories. And though she spoke little, her silence was rich. She taught them not to avoid pain, but to sit with it, to listen as one would to the wind. Her strength was no longer endurance, but invitation. Javan remained in the monastery, though many urged him to take a higher role, but he refused titles. He swept the courtyard as before, brewed tea at dawn, and watched the sunrise with the stillness of a stone in a stream. Travelers came to him now, not for answers, but for reflection. He no longer taught in words, but in the spaces between them. He had become a mirror, polished not by pride, but by presence. His greatest offering was the quiet he carried, into which others could hear their own truths. And though the volcano still stood, and the smoke still rose, no one feared it as before. For now, the mountain was no longer a monster, but a teacher, not because it changed, but because they did. Fear had not been conquered, but transformed. It had burned away the illusions, and in its place left something unshakable, a fire that did not destroy, but illuminated. There is a fire that does not burn, a flame that does not consume. It lives not in the mountains nor in the sky, but in the human heart. Fear often seems like the enemy, rising like smoke, choking clarity. But fear is not the darkness itself. It is the invitation to walk through it. The monk knew this, that fear, when faced, reveals not weakness, but a door into stillness, into presence, into truth. The old woman had carried pain for so long, not realizing it was also the seed of compassion. And the young man, his strength was not in his arms, but in his courage to tremble and still walk on. The mountain was never the challenge. The flame was never the danger. What truly holds us back is not the heat, but the stories we tell ourselves about our limits. We fear falling, not because we are weak, but because we have forgotten how to trust the ground beneath. When fear is denied, it festers. When it is fought, it fights back. But when fear is welcomed, like a guest at the threshold, it softens, it kneels, it becomes a guide, a gentle master pointing inward toward the center of our flame. Let the fire burn, but do not let it blind. Let it warm, but do not let it consume. Fear transformed becomes clarity. Doubt refined becomes stillness. And from stillness, the path reveals itself, not in leaps, but in footsteps. We do not walk to escape fear. We walk to become the ones who carry it differently, who shape it into a lantern, who let it light the way, like Javan, who bowed to silence, like Amma, who wept and rose, like Kael, who trembled and crossed. The mountain stands still, but within you, something has moved. As we reflect on the story we've just heard, we begin to see how fear, when embraced with understanding, can become a powerful catalyst for growth. In that moment of stillness, when we stop running and start listening, fear transforms. It no longer controls us. It guides us. But the journey doesn't stop here. In the next story, we meet another soul on the path. Someone who, like so many of us, stood at the edge of uncertainty, burdened by inner doubt. And yet, through mindfulness, compassion, or a single wise word, they discovered the courage to move forward, not in spite of fear, but because of it. This next story reminds us that fear often arises just before a breakthrough. It is the fire that purifies, the shadow that defines the light. Buddhist teachings do not ask us to deny fear, but rather to examine it closely, to sit with it, and to allow it to teach us. Fear can show us what we truly care about. It can push us toward awakening if we choose to respond with awareness instead of avoidance. So as we continue, carry this reflection with you. Fear is not a flaw in your path. It is the path. Now let us step into the next story, another window into the Buddha's timeless wisdom, another chance to understand how, even in our most vulnerable moments, strength is quietly waiting to rise. Far beyond the last rice field, past the bamboo groves and footpaths dusted with red earth, there stood a cliff known to the villagers as Heaven's Edge. Atop that cliff rested a single, colossal boulder, jagged, ancient, and untouched by human hands. It had the color of extinguished fire, a mix of blackened gray and crimson rust, and shimmered strangely when the monsoon light struck it from the west. None knew how it came to be there. Some claimed it had fallen from the sky during a storm of stars. Others believed it rose from the ground in defiance of the gods. But all agreed on one thing: it was impossible to cut. Not for lack of effort, many had tried. Blacksmiths, woodcutters, even royal stone masons had laid their hands on it. Chisels broke like twigs, saws dulled within minutes, and even iron drills cracked without leaving a scar. Eventually, people stopped trying. The stone was left to the birds and the wind, and fear of it became part of the land's silence. Children were warned never to play near it. Elders spoke of a spirit that dwelled within, waiting in stillness, feeding on the courage of men. Farmers, passing by, would avert their eyes. No one built homes on the cliff. No one touched the stone. It became a symbol, not of mystery or strength, but of futility. Fear of the stone was not dramatic or loud. It was quiet, like the unease in a room just before a storm breaks. And so the boulder remained, unchallenged, its surface gleaming like the back of an old beast that had long stopped roaring, but still commanded respect. That is, until the monk arrived. Tamor walked into the village as if drawn by silence itself. He came from the eastern mountain range, wrapped in a faded saffron robe, sandals worn thin by hundreds of miles. He spoke little, smiled even less, but bowed deeply to every living thing he passed. Tree, dog, farmer, stone. He bore no tools, no weapons, no scrolls, only a small bundle tied at the waist. Within it, a needle, long and silver, bent slightly at the tip. When the villagers asked what he sought, he simply looked to the cliff and replied, "To cut the stone." They thought he was mad. One woman laughed until she cried. But Timur did not flinch. He bowed again, not to them, but to the road ahead. Then he climbed. For 3 days, the villagers watched from below as he sat before the great stone. He did not strike it, nor did he curse it. He simply observed. From sunrise to twilight, he studied its angles, the cracks from rain, the patches where moss grew thicker than elsewhere. Then, on the 4th morning, he placed the needle between his palms, bowed to the boulder as if it were a master, and gently pressed the needle's tip to the stone, not to pierce it, not to mark it, but to begin. Among the villagers who gathered each day to witness the strange monk and his impossible task, there were 3 who watched more intently than the rest. They did not laugh like the others, nor turn away in boredom or disbelief. They stayed long after the sun dipped behind the hills, eyes fixed on Timur's unmoving form as he knelt before the stone. These 3 were strangers to one another, yet each carried a secret hunger, a restlessness not easily spoken of. Fear had shaped their lives in different ways, but it was the same root, the fear of never overcoming what life had handed them. And in Timur, they saw not madness, but a mirror. The first was a young blacksmith's apprentice named Leon. Strong of arm, but timid in spirit, he had lived in the shadow of his master's forge for years, hammering metal without ever forging something of his own. The fear of failure clenched his chest each time he touched a tool without supervision. His hands could lift iron, but his heart could not lift doubt. Watching Timur press a needle into stone stirred something buried in him, an ache to try, to break free, to dare. The second was an old widow named May, who lived on the village's edge, alone with her silkworms. She had once dreamed of traveling beyond the mountains, but age and sorrow had kept her anchored to the same patch of earth for decades. Her fear was quiet, like dust. It settled into the folds of her daily life and told her there was no longer time. But into Timur's silent persistence, she saw not youth, not strength, but devotion. And devotion, she realized, needed neither youth nor approval. It only needed presence. The third was a wanderer named Joro, whose life had been a chain of abandoned beginnings. He had studied medicine, then left it, tried farming, but gave up, learned calligraphy, only to toss his brushes into a river when frustration overtook him. His fear was not of the world, but of himself, the belief that he would never stay, never finish, never become. But Timur's stillness was like gravity, and each day that the monk remained there, unmoved, Joro's own scattered spirit felt drawn to that center. He began returning daily, sitting nearby, saying nothing. Days became weeks. The villagers' interest faded, but the three remained. Lian, May, and Joro came at dawn and left at dusk, not out of obligation, but because something invisible had tethered them to the act. They watched Timur press the same needle to the same spot, again and again, with a patience deeper than time. No mark appeared. No progress was visible. Yet each of the three felt something in themselves shift. Subtle, slow, but undeniable. Their fears, once cages, had become questions. And the question was this: if a man can face the impossible each day and not turn away, why can't I? It was on the 34th day that something imperceptible occurred. Not in the stone, but in the air around it. Dawn broke cold and pale, and mist clung to the mountain like a second skin. Timur, as always, was already at his station, the needle between his fingers, his gaze unblinking. As the first light touched the edge of the cliff, the wind changed. It did not howl or sweep dramatically, but shifted ever so slightly, brushing the grasses in reverse, as though the mountain had taken a breath inward. Those present, Lian, May, and Joro, felt it not on their skin, but in their bones. A stillness heavier than silence descended. Then, a sound, barely audible, like the whisper of paper tearing. Lian leaned forward. May clutched her scarf. Joro stopped mid-breath, but when they looked at the stone, it remained as it always had, unmarked, enormous, complete. And yet, they knew something had changed. Not in the stone, in them. Lian was the first to act. That same evening, he returned to the forge, not as an apprentice, but as one who dared to fail. He waited until his master had left, then lit the fire himself. His hands trembled as he lifted the hammer, not from weakness, but from anticipation. The iron was stubborn, unyielding. Sparks flew like angry insects. But Lian did not stop. He struck again and again, not to finish something perfect, but to begin something real. And by the time the moon rose, his arms were sore, the metal was bent, and a crude blade lay before him, uneven, flawed, but his. He named it not a weapon, but a reminder. May, too, began to shift. The next morning, she did not tend her silkworms. Instead, she gathered a bundle of cloth, pieces she had dyed long ago and hidden away, and walked to the village center. She spread them on the ground like offerings. The villagers ignored her at first, thinking she had finally gone mad with age. But slowly, a few women approached. Then children. Then even Shen, who remembered her as a quiet widow. May did not speak much. She only pointed to the colors, the patterns she had once dreamed of selling in cities she had never seen. She didn't sell anything that day, but when dusk fell, her cloths were covered with footprints, proof, she thought, that her silence had been broken. Joro, the wanderer, did something simpler, but no less profound. He returned to the river, the same one where he had flung his calligraphy brushes in frustration months ago. He sat by its edge and waited, not for inspiration, but for stillness. When a branch floated by, he reached for it. He broke it to the right length. He peeled its bark. He found a rock and sharpened the end into a point. It was crude. It would not make elegant strokes, but it was enough. That night, under moonlight, he practiced one word again and again on old paper he found in the temple's bin. That word was remain, and high above them all, Timur remained as he was, bending his spine toward the boulder, the needle steady in his fingers, the same point receiving the same pressure, unchanged. He made no declaration. He asked for no audience. But the first fracture had occurred, and though it was not visible to the eye, it ran deep. Not through stone, but through the armor each heart wears when it fears too much. The monk did not need to break the rock. The real work was already happening, where no one could see. By the 60th day, the stone remained, as ever, unmoved, its surface dull in the midday sun, its silence a mountain unto itself. But the presence of the monk had changed the rhythm of the village. What was once a curiosity had become a still point in daily life. People came not to gawk anymore, but to breathe. The cliff, once feared, now felt sacred. Children played further up the path, but did so quietly, instinctively aware of the stillness that surrounded Timur. Merchants sometimes brought bread and left it without a word. A farmer began watering the dry grass nearby, and every morning, without fail, the three watchers returned, not because they believed the stone would change, but because they knew they had. Lian had grown quieter, his steps more deliberate. The forge no longer frightened him. He had burned through failure enough times to recognize it as warmth, not punishment. His blades were not yet beautiful, but they cut. He had even begun to teach a younger boy how to hold a hammer, how not to fear its weight. When the boy asked why the monk did what he did, Lian said simply, "To remember what we're capable of." May, too, changed in small, quiet ways. She began gathering herbs from the forest, not for trade, but for offering. Every few days, she placed bundles wrapped in cloth at the base of the cliff. Lavender, mint, dried roots. She didn't ask for anything. She didn't expect answers. But each offering was like a conversation with time itself, a gesture saying, "I'm still here." The villagers noticed. One day, a young woman asked May to teach her how to dye cloth the way she did. May hesitated, then nodded, and Joro, the wanderer, the abandoner, had begun writing letters, not to send, but to practice staying. He wrote to the father he left behind, to the friends whose names he forgot, to the version of himself he used to mock. The letters were raw, uneven, scratched in ink made from ash and oil. But he kept them, folded carefully, tied in a cloth he carried under his robe. Every morning, before he sat near to Moor, he wrote one more. The act itself became a kind of prayer, that beginnings could become middles, that middles didn't have to end in silence. And the stone? It remained, but something beneath its silence had shifted. The cliff no longer felt like a warning. It felt like a teacher. Tamor continued as he always had, needle to stone, breath steady, mind still. Some believed he was chiseling truth into the world, not with force, but with presence. Others thought he was mad, but Lian, May, and Joro knew. The stone did not need to crack to be broken. Fear was never in the boulder. It had always lived in them. And now, grain by grain, it was being worn away. On the 100th morning, a storm rolled in from the east. It did not announce itself with thunder, but arrived like a silent hand, pushing clouds across the sky, turning day into dusk. The wind howled over the cliffs, bending bamboo and scattering dry leaves like brittle thoughts. Rain began, not in sheets, but in sharp, needling bursts that stung the skin and soaked the earth. Most villagers stayed indoors, but Lion, May, and Joro climbed the path as always, soaked to the bone by the time they reached the stone. And there he was, Tamor, still kneeling, still working, as if the rain were nothing more than a breath on the surface of the world. Then it happened. A sound, sudden and small. Not a crack, not a thunderclap. It was like the sound of breath caught in the throat. Fragile, human. The three froze. Tamor did not move. Slowly, almost tenderly, a thin line appeared across the face of the stone, so fine it could have been mistaken for a trick of light. But it grew. From the point where the needle had touched day after day, it spread like a whisper across the surface, silent, graceful, inevitable. The boulder, once proud and whole, exhaled, and in that moment, it was not broken. It was released. The rain did not stop. The wind did not calm. But in the heart of the storm, there was stillness. Timur laid the needle down, not in triumph, but in reverence. He bowed low to the stone, to the crack, to the journey. Then, without a word, he rose. He did not look at the watchers, nor did he speak to the mountain. He simply turned, barefoot and soaked, and walked down the path he had once climbed. And though he left the stone behind, the lesson remained. In the days that followed, many climbed the path to see the crack. Some touched it, some cried. A few laughed, not out of mockery, but in disbelief that something so massive could be altered by something so small. The villagers began calling the stone Timur's Line. It became a place of pilgrimage, not for miracles, but for remembrance. And Lian, May, and Joro, each in their own way, carried on what Timur had begun, not by cutting stone, but by cutting through fear. Fear, they learned, does not vanish all at once. It is worn down, as stone is, by patience, by presence, by the quiet persistence of those who do not turn away. The boulder on the cliff still stands, cracked, but whole. But the greater stone, the one inside each of them, had been moved, not shattered, but softened. And from that softening came something stronger than steel. Courage that does not need to conquer, only continue. There is a stone in each of us, not the one that sits upon the mountain, but the one that lies hidden beneath our breath, behind our silence, beneath every hesitation. This stone is not made of granite or basalt. It is made of doubt, memory, fear. We are born carrying it, or perhaps we build it as we grow, layering it with every wound we do not speak, every dream we delay, every love we lose and lock away. It becomes familiar. Heavy, yes, but known. So we learn to live around it, not through it. The monk, Timur, did not set out to break a rock. He set out to remain. And in that act of remaining, through sun, through storm, through ridicule and silence, he became more than a man before a stone. He became a reflection of something deeper, the slow, stubborn power of presence. To remain is not to be passive. It is to be unwavering, to face that which seems impossible, not with fists clenched, but with breath steady, not with shouting, but with returning again and again. Fear thrives in absence. It grows in the spaces we avoid, in the rooms we never enter inside ourselves. It tells us to wait for the perfect moment, the right tool, the certainty of success. But there is no perfect moment. The needle is never enough. And yet, it begins with that, one small point of contact between effort and resistance, between faith and the unknown, That is the lesson of the stone. Not that it cracked, but that someone dared to touch it with something so fragile, so foolish, so pure. In the lives of Lian, May, and Joro, we see that transformation is not a burst of lightning. It is erosion, not an explosion, but a melting. The edge of fear wears down not by war, but by repetition. The hammering of presence, the touch that does not withdraw. They each broke their stone not by force, but by showing up to themselves again and again, until the stone had no choice but to yield. In the end, we are not asked to conquer fear. We are asked to sit beside it, to breathe with it, to watch it crack, grain by grain, under the weight of our stillness. Let the stone remain. Let the needle tremble. But let us show up, for it is not in the breaking that we are transformed. It is in the trying. What we just witnessed is a powerful reminder. Fear doesn't always appear as loud panic or visible trembling. Sometimes it hides in hesitation, in the quiet moments when we doubt ourselves, when we second-guess our choices, or hold back from expressing our truth. Yet within every fearful moment lies an opportunity, an opening to grow, to act, and to awaken. As we move forward in this journey, the next story brings us a new perspective. It comes from another chapter of the Buddha's teachings, one that invites us to sit face to face with fear, not as an enemy, but as a messenger, a teacher. In Buddhism, fear is never just dismissed. It's acknowledged with presence and compassion. Instead of trying to fight or suppress it, the practice is to see it clearly, to understand its nature. And through that understanding, we loosen its grip. The next story you'll hear illustrates this beautifully. It shows how even the most unsettling fear can be the very force that drives inner transformation. The protagonist, much like you and me, reaches a breaking point, only to discover a breakthrough. Not because they eliminated fear, but because they changed their relationship with it. So before we begin, take a moment to reflect. What fear are you carrying right now? And what if it's not standing in your way, but pointing you toward your path? Let us continue now with the next story, a tale of fear, courage, and awakening, rooted in the deep, compassionate wisdom of the Buddha. The sun had not risen for 7 days. Across the valley and along the riverbanks, fear curled in every shadow, and silence grew where laughter once lived. The people in the highlands whispered of divine punishment, of the wrath of the sun goddess who had vanished behind her golden veil. Some blamed the rich merchant who had desecrated the sacred shrine with greed. Others blamed the poor boy who had bathed in the holy stream with unclean hands. But Mogan, the monk, neither blamed nor feared. He sat cross-legged beneath the dead tree atop the stone hill, eyes closed, listening not to the wind, but to the trembling hearts of those who still dared to hope. Long ago, the villagers had built a great sun altar carved into the mountain's flank, a place where light danced at dawn and prayers rose like smoke into the heavens. It was Mogan who had tended that altar for decades, sweeping the stone each morning before the first light touched it. Yet now, no light came. The merchant, cloaked in silk and worry, came to the monk with trembling hands, offering gold bowls and incense. "Fix it." His eyes pleaded without words. But Mogan only nodded, gently pushing the bowls away. "You cannot buy back the sun," he murmured to himself as the merchant departed, shoulders hunched beneath the weight of wealth that could not comfort. In the village below, a boy named Lin lay on a straw mat, eyes wide open through nights that refused to end. His family had no candles, only the moonlight leaking through the slats in their roof. And now, even that was swallowed by thick clouds. He feared monsters in the dark at first. Then he feared never seeing light again. Each day, he carried water from the dry stream bed to his mother's hut, though the journey grew heavier with silence. Fear, to Lin, was not some beast that roared. It was the quiet that gnawed, the endless waiting. One day, he stood at the edge of the monk's hill, clutching an empty jug. He did not speak, for even his voice felt too small in this lightless world. But Mogan heard the boy's feet, and that was enough. That night, the monk gathered no followers, made no declarations. He only stood slowly and began walking west, toward the place where legends said the sun goddess once wept into a pool of fire. The villagers watched from their huts as the thin figure of Mogan passed beneath the starless sky, a silent candle in the dark. Behind him, two shadows followed, the merchant stripped of his silk, and Lin still carrying his empty jug. Neither man nor boy knew why they walked, only that fear was no longer the wall, but the door. The path west was no road at all, just a scatter of rocks between cliffs and ravines, where wind howled like forgotten spirits, and the earth cracked underfoot like brittle parchment. The monk Mogan walked with no map, no staff, only his breath steady as the rhythm of an old prayer. Behind him, Lin's small legs struggled to keep pace, but he dared not complain. The merchant, once carried by palanquins, now stumbled with each step, his soft shoes torn, his fingers blistered from clutching stones to keep balance, but no one turned back. The world behind them was dim and broken. What lay ahead, though terrifying, shimmered faintly with the promise of meaning. On the third day, they reached the edge of the Cinder Plateau, a land so scorched that even the sky above seemed bleached of color. Charred trees stood like blackened bones, and ash drifted like slow snow across the cracked earth. Here, the tales said, the sun goddess had cast down her sorrow, burning away all who dared approach her in arrogance. Lin shivered despite the heat. The merchant wept without shame. But Mogan stood still, palms open. "She is not wrath," he whispered inwardly. "She is light, misunderstood." As if in reply, the wind carried a single golden feather, spiraling gently down from the whitened sky, and Mogan caught it without reaching. That night, they camped near a jagged ridge where no grass grew. There was no food left, only silence. Lin stared at the feather, now resting in the monk's hands, wondering if it truly belonged to a goddess. The merchant, eyes hollow with hunger, mumbled of past banquets, of honeyed pears and roasted duck, but no one listened. Mogan sat still, tracing circles in the dust. He did not eat nor sleep. Fear has a voice, he thought, but it is not always loud. Sometimes it is the silence between heartbeats. The wind picked up again, and with it came distant humming, like a melody remembered from childhood dreams. Lin leaned into it instinctively, as though his soul recognized it before his mind could. At dawn, there was no sun, but there was glow. A faint gold shimmer rose from behind the ridge, soft and quiet, like the breath of something waking after long sleep. Mogan rose and bowed. "She hears," he whispered, and began to walk again. But this time, the journey was no longer lonely. The ground warmed, not with fire, but with memory. They walked across the plateau, where shadows softened and ash no longer clung. Lin began to hum the tune he had heard in the wind, and even the merchant, humbled and silent, joined in softly. They were not approaching the sun goddess. They were being drawn into her presence, not by merit, but by sincerity. By the 7th day of their journey, their bodies were weak, but their minds no longer trembled. The land had changed, not by miracle, but through their eyes. What was once barren now pulsed with subtle energy, as if the earth itself had begun to remember warmth. They arrived at a narrow gorge known in old stories as the Breathless Gate, a place where air stood still and time forgot to move. Legends warned that beyond, it was the realm where fear grew teeth and form, feeding on the doubts of those who dared enter. Mogan did not hesitate. He stepped forward barefoot, palms joined in silent reverence. The merchant paused, but followed. Lin, his jug still empty, took a deep breath and whispered to himself, "Even if fear takes shape, I will not run." Inside the gorge, darkness was not mere absence of light. It was presence. It moved. It watched. The walls of the narrow path seemed to breathe, exhaling memories, long buried. One by one, illusions rose. For the merchant, it was his youth, a boy mocked for poverty, who swore he would never be weak again. He saw himself clutching coins like armor, choking on gold. For Lin, it was a vision of his mother's face, pale and lifeless, with his own hands stained as if he had failed her. He gasped, staggered, but kept walking. Mogan, too, was tested, not by visions, but by silence so deep it almost unmade him. A silence where even the teachings of old masters seemed to fade, and only doubt remained. But in that silence, something stirred, not from without, but within. Mogan let go of his last attachment, the need to understand. He did not resist the darkness, nor seek to escape it. He simply bowed inwardly, not to a god, not to a force, but to the experience itself. As he did, the darkness loosened, the pressure lifted, the gorge exhaled. One by one, the visions faded. The merchant fell to his knees, no longer clutching, but releasing. "I am not gold," he whispered. Lin knelt too, tears streaking his dusty face. "She is not gone," he said of his mother. "She is with me." The path ahead widened. The end of the gorge spilled out into light. Not blazing, not triumphant, but gentle. They emerged onto a cliffside that overlooked the Valley of Flame, where the first rays of sunlight, after many days, streaked the sky like golden threads weaving a tapestry of dawn. And there she stood, not towering, not blinding, but radiant in stillness. The sun goddess did not speak, nor judge. She simply looked at them, as if to say, "You have seen me, not because you came to find me, but because you dared to find yourselves." Mogan bowed with no need for words. The merchant closed his eyes and smiled, not in victory, but in release. Lin, still holding the jug, felt its weight change. When he opened it, it was filled not with water, but with light, soft, steady, and warm. The journey back was not faster, nor easier, but it was no longer weighted by dread. What had once been a trial of endurance had become a procession of gratitude. The air, though thin, felt generous. Even the rocks seemed to step aside slightly, as if the land itself honored their courage. Lin often paused to watch how the light played upon the world now, how it touched the cracks in the cliffs, how it glinted off the tears in the merchant's eyes, how it rested softly on Mogan's weathered robe. It was the same light as before, yet different, as though the very act of having walked through darkness had taught them how to see. When they passed again through the cinder plateau, the ash no longer clung. It danced in spirals, caught in the golden wind like scattered blessings. The merchant, once crushed by shame and fear, now walked with open hands. He stopped by the altar ruins they had passed days ago and set down a single gold ring, not as offering, but as remembrance. "Let this stay," he said to the wind, "as proof that I have nothing left to prove." Mogan said nothing. Lin only nodded, understanding not with words, but with the fullness of his chest, the warmth that no longer needed fire to exist. On the 9th day, clouds gathered once more, but this time they brought rain, not as punishment, but as gift. The dry river they had once walked along now ran with singing waters. Lin rushed to fill his jug, the one that had carried nothing through the darkest places, and now brimmed with the gift of sky. He didn't drink at once. He knelt by the stream and looked into the water, seeing not just his reflection, but his journey, each scar, each fear faced and made gentle. "Thank you," he whispered, not to any god, but to the path, to the pain, to himself. When the trio returned to the village, no fanfare awaited them. The sun had returned, yes, but the people had already begun rebuilding, not out of hope, but necessity. And yet, when Mogan appeared on the hill once more, sweeping the old stone altar, the children watched in silence. The merchant, now with simple clothes, opened a house of rest where food and warmth were shared freely. Lin, still young, became the quiet helper of elders, carrying light in his eyes wherever he walked. No one needed to tell the tale. The change was evident in how they moved, in how they were no longer chased by fear, but guided by it. Seasons passed. The sun rose and set without interruption, yet it was no longer taken for granted. The villagers, once passive beneath the sky, now planted their seeds with intention, sang their prayers not out of fear, but as celebration. They did not speak often of the darkness, nor the journey 3 among them had taken. But sometimes, as evening mist descended, Lin would sit near the altar and place his jug beside him, not to fetch water, but to remember the silence it had once carried. That silence had not been emptiness. It had been preparation. Mogan grew older. His footsteps slowed, his breath shallower, yet the clarity in his gaze only deepened. He spoke even less than before. But those who sat near him said his silence spoke of things beyond words, of nights faced without fear, of dawns received without demand. One morning, the villagers found him sitting beneath the tree on the hill where he had always gone. His eyes were closed, his body still, and around him the earth glowed faintly, as if warmed from within. He had not left them. He had returned to the same place he had never truly departed from, the center of stillness. The merchant, now without titles or treasures, became a wanderer, but not one who ran from the world. He walked into it, village by village, offering not wares, but wisdom. His wealth was no longer measured in coins, but in questions he asked gently. In eyes he met fully. In fears he no longer fled. People called him strange. What merchant seeks no profit? But children followed him, and elders smiled at him, sensing something rare, a man who had seen himself and chosen kindness. As for Lin, he grew into a man not known for words, but for presence. He rebuilt his family's hut, not just as a shelter, but as a space where others could come and rest. His jug remained near the door, empty often, yet glowing faintly at dawn, as if reminding all who saw it. Light is not a thing to be taken, but something to be revealed. Lin did not become a monk nor a teacher, but people came to him with questions anyway, and he answered them not with certainty, but with listening. And in that listening, fear found its way into stillness and melted. And far beyond the mountain, beyond the gorge and the valley, where the sky opens wide with fire and peace, the sun goddess still watched, not as ruler, but as witness. For she had never truly left. She had simply waited, not for worship nor sacrifice, but for courage. And now it lived in the hearts of those who had dared to walk toward her, not by slaying fear, but by walking with it, until it no longer needed to roar. There is a kind of fear that does not scream, but settles deep within the heart, quiet, heavy, and unseen. It is the fear of uncertainty, of being forgotten, of being unworthy. The story of Mogan, Lin, and the merchant is not a tale of slaying monsters or conquering the heavens. It is a story of turning inward, of stepping into the caves of the self where no light reaches, until one is brave enough to light it from within. Mogan, the monk, teaches us that wisdom is not about escaping fear, but recognizing it as a teacher. He does not run from the darkness. He bows to it. In doing so, he reveals the most profound truth, that fear is not our enemy, but our unacknowledged companion. It is the part of us that yearns to be seen, not silenced. Lin, the boy, carries an empty jug through the hardest parts of the world. That jug, useless to others, becomes the vessel of transformation. It teaches us that even the emptiness we carry has meaning. Emptiness is not a lack. It is a space for light. Lin does not become great through words or strength, but through his willingness to remain open. And in that openness, the divine speaks. The merchant, born from ambition, is the mirror of most of us. He lives with the illusion that value is earned by accumulation. Yet, stripped of gold and status, he finds his true wealth, the courage to be vulnerable. It is not weakness that humbles him. It is humility that frees him. He teaches us that the true transaction of life is not giving to receive, but releasing to awaken. And the sun goddess? She does not punish nor reward. She waits. Not in the heavens, but in the heart of every being who dares to stop running. She is not light in the sky. She is the light we uncover when we sit in darkness without flinching. To see her is not to win something, but to become something. In this tale, fear is not cast aside. It is held, understood, and walked with. And through that companionship, fear dissolves. What remains is not the absence of fear, but the presence of courage. Courage not as conquest, but as clarity. Not as noise, but as stillness. Not as force, but as presence. As we reach the end of today's journey, we carry with us more than just stories. We carry the echoes of timeless wisdom. Through the teachings of the Buddha, we've seen how fear, rather than being something to suppress or avoid, can be transformed into a powerful force for inner growth and clarity. Each story has reminded us that fear is not the enemy. It is a signal, a signpost pointing us toward what matters. It shows us where we are still holding on, where we need to let go, and where our deepest strength lies hidden in the stillness of meditation, in the courage of compassion, and in the quiet acts of self-awareness. Fear loses its power. It no longer paralyzes. It motivates. This is the great shift the Buddha spoke of. Not the removal of fear, but the awakening of wisdom that changes how we relate to it. So the next time fear arises, whether it comes as anxiety, self-doubt, or resistance, pause, breathe. Ask yourself, what is this fear trying to teach me? You may be surprised to find that underneath it lies your most profound potential. Thank you for walking with us through these stories and for opening your heart to the lessons they offer. May you continue on your path with clarity, compassion, and the quiet strength to face all things, even fear, with peace. If these stories brought you insight or comfort, consider sharing them with someone who might need them. And until we meet again, may you be safe, may you be well, and may your fear become the fire that lights your way forward.